Hello to all our lovely listeners, and particularly those who we were able to meet in person at the recent Boys at the Crossroads conference in Bristol. Welcome to the latest episode of Now and Men, the podcast about men, masculinities and gender equality. It's Sandy Ruxton here, and I'm with Stephen Burrell as ever. Hi, Stephen.
Hi, Sandy. We're really delighted to have Gary Barker with us here today. He'll be well known to many of you as he's been a leading voice globally on gender equality and men and masculinities over the past 30 years. He's the CEO and co-founder of an organisation called Equimundo, and we'll talk more about their work in a minute. He's also the co-founder of Men Care, which is a global campaign to promote men's involvement as caregivers. And he's co-created the International Men and Gender Equality Survey, which is also called Images. And that's the largest survey of men's attitudes and behaviours around the world related to violence, fatherhood and gender equality.
You've been so busy, Gary, really. You've also acted as an advisor to the UN, the World Bank, national governments, international foundations and corporations on strategies to engage men and boys in promoting gender equality. You've also won a string of international accolades, too long to go through the whole list, but that's for the groundbreaking work that you and the organisations you represent have done. And if that isn't already enough, you found time to write one non-fiction book and 4 novels, is that right?
That's right, yeah.
That's right. Well, welcome to Now and Men, Gary. We thought we'd start off by asking you about your journey, really, seeing as how you've been involved in this work for such a time. I mean, your name is closely associated with the organisations Equimundo and before that Promundo and the Instituto Promundo in Brazil. But maybe we can ask you how you first got involved in working on men and masculinities. Was that something you'd been thinking about for a while, or did you have a sudden realization, this is what I want to do with my life? How did it happen?
Yeah, we could spend probably the whole hour just on that. I mean, that list of things that you read, I mean, I feel exhausted when you read it. But it wasn't, there wasn't sort of some master plan at the beginning of saying, hey, this is the arc of male allyship work and masculinities that I envision doing. I mean, it happened with lots of colleagues and lots of others. None of that was done alone. When did I become aware of the this notion of masculinities, manhood, how we're made and socially constructed and built as physical and subjects of these ideas around masculinities. It was a journey that the vocabulary came a lot later, but the journey started a lot with a father who's a social worker. He passed away last year, but really made his profession and his ethic was about caring, and really contrasted some of what I saw around me living, particularly when we moved from California to Texas and saw this kind of gun-toting, take no prisoners, cowboy version of masculinity, which is partly a stereotype, it's partly a caricature, but it's also very true. And one piece of that arc of the story for me was witnessing a school shooting in my secondary school, in my high school, that was 1977. Before we called these things school shootings, before we had hide in place, shelter in place, before we had trauma support, and it was a young man with access to a gun. He had a vendetta against an individual young man who he alleged stole his girlfriend, and all kinds of the masculine norms, the mental health issues, the access to guns, the lack of conversation after what happened. There was absolutely nothing. They sent us back to class an hour later, no conversation about what we had witnessed, the 100 or so of us who were in the high school dining hall where the shooting and the killing took place. I think other moments at my university trajectory, my own relationships, my adopted siblings who had histories of victimization of violence from male caregivers, all those things led me first to work on issues of survivors of violence. I worked in Central America with refugee and street children, and then I moved to Brazil in the early 90s to work with girls who were being sexually exploited in a joint NGO UNICEF project. And along the way just kept saying, I'm kind of putting myself in here as a helper coming along to try to support those who have survived violence, not really taking that much of the moments to look at my own experiences and trajectories of witnessing violence, and much less my own trajectories about masculinities. But along the way in that work with UNICEF and in Brazil and some encounters with some amazing women feminist leaders and some gay rights activists who I had the chance to do some work with, they very much kind of pointed and said, where are you in here? White, middle-class, heterosexual man from the US who's asking us lots of questions about gender and sexuality and violence, and where are you in this story? And I think having a chance to work with some folks who were both followers and partners of Paulo Freire, and also had the chance to actually be in an event with him once as well around how do we take this critical understanding of the world around us and become part of collective action. And it was a lot of questioning in there that colleagues said, Gary, you keep asking these questions about masculinities, connecting with others who were writing about it and thinking about it, that said, there is something here, and informed by Raywin's work and some other Latin American activists at the time said, there's both a personal journey I need to take on this and to be more reflective, and started together with some other colleagues kind of a first men's discussion group, probably around the time that some of the stuff that like Achilles' heel and some other stuff in the UK happening. So kind of a put on your own mask and do some inner work. And at the same time engage with some colleagues to say, and this is political too. And where do we go with that? So it sounds kind of coherent when you look at it later, but it was a lot of just lovely opportunities, tragic, realities of my own life and particularly those that I have been a witness and supporter to. And then just really inspired by some Brazilian activists who I would say, made me do this. You will do this, guy. We need you in this space as a male-identified individual, as a heterosexual, middle-class man. We need you in this space, not to take it over, not to own it, to co-own it, not to own it exclusively. And I think that work in Brazil was foundational for who I am as a person and that professional trajectory.
Because your academic training was as a developmental psychologist, is that right? Is that where you did your
PhD and
on? Is that part of the mix as well?
That's part of the mix as well. First I did I did journalism and then public policy with the idea that I'm the generation that journalists toppled a corrupt president, right, with Watergate, and ended a war in some ways. If we look at the Vietnam War, and that was my childhood TV news at the end of the day was how many killed in Vietnam. And U.S. media was a progressive investigative journalist able to both contribute to ending a horrible war. It was only a brief reprieve until the U.S. started the next one, but was very empowered by that. And we see a president toppled, and watching that on the news, to me, journalists were like, this is where progressive action takes place. So I did my undergrad and did some writing. I was managing editor at my big state university newspaper. Had some fun some fun feeling like I was a 20-year-old investigative journalist calling out some corruption on my own university campus. So I was very intrigued by that as a profession at first, and but along the way said I wanted to actually be more in some of the action of making the world better. So did a master's in public policy, thought about sort of what policy allows us to do, and I focused on development in the international development context, and from there moved to Central America, and that was my first work with survivors of violence. Years later, as I started to ask these questions about masculinities, I found developmental psychology to be an interesting kind of place to ask, how do we make men? How do we become so? And what are these combinations? And I suppose what I liked about it, and bringing in elements of sociology and anthropology, but that it brought, both the individual, the subject of what happens in our interpsychic, how do we develop and think about and make meaning of the world as individuals in a collective, and structural setting. So I found, that was a place to situate a question of how do we make men so? And particularly what I became interested in looking at was the field of resilience. And I suppose if we think about, I like to think about it as resistance, which is in the gender space, it was so easy to feel that our descriptions of men are this way, women are this way, masculinities are this way, femininities are this way, that it felt so rigid often as we think about it from a structural point of view, developmental psychology gave me a place to situate it around the meaning that we make as active meaning makers of the world around us. We're not to put that into a sort of liberal construct that somehow we can we make ourselves. Not that kind of hubris of human will, let's call it. But to say that it did give me a space to think about how men and women, individuals of all gender identities, enmeshed in these gender systems, still can resist and push back and make different meaning, become activists, or become, succumb to the impact of trauma and have trouble, being the connected, caring human beings that we want to be. So yeah, I just found it gave me a lens to look at masculinities with hope, with a kind of complexity of the structural and the systemic and the culture, together with where individuals sit.
It feels like all of those elements really have gone into your early non-fiction book, Dying to Be Men, in 2005, and that, as far as I can tell, is about the challenges young men face in growing up in societies where violence is the norm. And you describe one of the incidents that you witnessed there. But really you were beginning to confront questions like, which version of manhood do I subscribe to? What does it take to be a real man? I just wondered if you wanted to say a bit more about the book itself, because that was a key moment for you, perhaps.
Yeah, it was. And, it was my PhD dissertation, and I was doing research both in Chicago and in Rio de Janeiro with young men in settings of high violence. In Chicago, this is the racially segregated southern part of Chicago, where very deliberate policies said the African American community could not live in the nicer lakefront communities on the north side of downtown. This is where you must live and be. The kind of histories of exclusion there, the attempts of a government estate to be meaningful and provide services, mixed with how attractive gangs were for some young men, and also just how actively gangs recruited some young men. And then the Brazilian part of that work was in one favela called Maré. It's the one kind of close to the international airport, for those who have been in Rio. Also some similar, but historically quite different, but African Brazilian majority, low income, social exclusion, long histories, at least since kind of the mid 80s, of drug trafficking as well, who also vie a lot for the identities and the hearts and minds of young men, engaging them either as like, you vote for it for your team, or we actually actively want you to be part of it and we recruit you into it. So understanding young men, and I was particularly interested in those who found ways to push back against the often violent, traditional, rigid ideas about manhood. Even those who weren't in gangs often bought into a lot of the logic of the versions of masculinities that gangs produced. And so what I did is spent time in both communities over the course of about a year and a half, hanging out with, listening to, following, accompanying, witnessing some of the horrors to their lives, and trying to make sense of how was it possible for some young men to find different forms of support, different ideas about manhood, what made it possible. And the answer to that is a combination of, life circumstances. Did you have a family members, often moms, often aunts, grandmothers? Men were often scarce because of just what happens to men, incarceration, migration for work, because they couldn't feel like they could hold a family steady, they moved on to another family. So the absence of men, or the movement of men in and out of boys and young men's and girls' lives, obviously, as well. And it was mostly mothers, grandmothers, aunts who held families together. Whether they could hold the family together and keep a son from joining a gang often had to do with not less willpower and more about what did you have around you? What affordances did you have that you could offer some support for a son, a grandson, a nephew to stay out of gangs? Could you physically get up in the middle of the night and drag him home from a dance or a place where he could be recruited into a gang? Some was as much as physical strength and stamina. It was sometimes men in the guise of coaches or teachers or youth workers who could model and show another version of manhood. And then there was an individual part, which was an awareness of, if I to call it metacognition. I can look at how I make decisions and which ones lead to harm and which ones lead to better outcomes. I saw my brother go a pathway. I saw my cousin go a pathway and I want to do it differently. And then, did you get lucky? Because the other part was that in both settings, about a third of young men had some encounter with the law, with oppressive, racist justice systems. Often for not doing anything, or often a crime that you would say was being a young black man in the wrong place at the wrong time. So were you lucky enough that you stayed below the radar of police and of gangs themselves? So kind of all that combination of both the structural and the individual. So yeah, I could talk more about that, but that was kind of the headline that came out of that. It's a mixture of all the above, and if we're to support young men in any setting to step into healthier, connected, nonviolent versions of manhood, I suppose the simple cliche could be it takes a village, rather than it's some one moment of Saul on the road to Damascus that you saw the light. It was a lot of stuff that mixed together in young men's lives in complex ways to provide those pathways to healthier versions of manhood.
Yeah, and in a way, I mean, you founded, I think you founded Instituto Promundo about that time.
Yep.
And then that became later on Promundo-US, and now it's Equimundo. I mean, in a way, that organizational journey is also your journey as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
Really. And I wondered if you wanted to say anything about that as well, how those organizations transmogrified, changed over time, and and why that was really.
Yeah, I mean, I had the good fortune of both connecting with the Brazilian feminists and organizations working in sexuality education and HIV prevention, in LGBTI plus rights, in children's rights, and so my co-founder Miguel Fontes, who registered Instituto Promundo as an organization. He had been working on the issue of HIV in children and kind of structural factors that led young people to be vulnerable to HIV/AIDS, and I brought in the masculinities question, and we kind of melded a bit of the community-based developmental psychology, to call it that, with public health that Miguel and colleagues brought in, and really the focus over those first 10 years of Instituto Promundo in Brazil were how to build an evidence base around that work with men and boys with this gendered lens could actually be impactful, that it wasn't just a really important political and academic question, but that we could show that by bringing this lens of how are masculinities made in a given setting and how can we promote healthier, nonviolent ones, could we prove that it worked? And that wasn't just hey, look at us, this works. This was for us an ethical and political question, because there are huge demands and needs for all kinds of interventions and support and funding and redistribution of wealth in low-income settings like favelas in Rio de Janeiro, and lots of funding needed for supporting survivors of violence, particularly women, survivors of men's violence. So as we thought about our feminist kind of gender equality space, for us it was really important to say, does this work achieve something that the really, really crucial, vital work that women have been leading to support women survivors of violence or help women stay out of violent relationships, that we need to show this works, that this is worth investing in. And so many of our first years were spent doing that. How could we build this into, have it be community-led, have it be gender transformative? By that we mean it was trying to change norms and power dynamics around masculinities and gender. Could we look at opportunities for scaling up? Particularly, we worked a lot with the health sector in Brazil, local level in Rio, but also nationally in Brazil. And did it work elsewhere? And so partnerships, particularly elsewhere in Latin America. Building a field of practice together with others. I don't want to say we were the only ones by any means. And then along the way, we said, if we are to convince policymakers, funders, the general public, that this is beyond just a small niche of work, we need bigger data sets. And so connected up with some folks who were doing household survey data around around gender, and said, what do we want to know from men? A lot of our discussions of men in UN policy, Ministry of Health policy, national policies, is from listening to women. And absolutely that is vital, but we weren't doing a lot to really have, what do we know that men think about these issues? And with all the limitations that sample surveys and household data collection can do, we said, let's try this. And a few funders said, we love this idea, we need this data. And again, I would say, as in several things in my life, just the luck, or us as an organization, the luck and good fortune of connecting with some amazing partners along the way. And what started off as a 6-country study became a 50-country study over the next 10 years. And really helped, frame a lot of support, a lot of help build a lot of work to think about engaging men and masculinities in national policies. And then along that way, it made sense for us to think about if we wanted to kind of continue to be able to lead that work rather than just be a kind of one-off provider of technical assistance now and then. It made sense for us to think about a U.S. office or somewhere where we had the possibility to connect with a lot of the funders in this space and a lot of the international policy-making spaces. So we opened what was then Promundo-US and several other partner NGOs around the same time, kind of spun off of our first work in Brazil. And so we founded Promundo-US, a partnership as well in Chile, an NGO that we helped support, an NGO in Congo where we were doing work around trauma and men in the backdrop of conflict. And we called that the Promundo Global Consortium and had that for a few years and decided at a certain point it felt too much like a kind of a replication of an international development NGO, which we didn't want. It was spending too much time in kind of log frames and not enough time in the activism that we think needs to be there. So we've decided in the last year to kind of, we still work together with all the organizations at some level, but we decided that the consortium model was feeling too much like a clunky, big INGO. And so we decided to rename ourselves, and we thought a name that said what we were about in this political moment. So we made it Equimundo, Center for Masculinities and Social Justice. So that takes us kind of into 2022.
That's a hugely impressive array of work. And I mean, the Images survey provides so much valuable data, doesn't it, really? And I suppose one thing I was interested in relation to that, I guess, was, earlier this year, I think you released a kind of status report, didn't you, kind of based on all the surveys which have been done so far. So I was just wondering if you had any kind of observations on like how things have changed over time, that the survey's been able to pick up on. And also, does it also help you to identify how there might be kind of geographical variations in constructions of masculinity?
Yeah, and it tells us a lot about just the politics of it, and we may come back to that topic later on as well. Of we in a few settings and in some of our first surveys, we did see that the younger we have one country, just one, where we've actually been able to carry it out in 2 moments in time. So our ability to talk about changes over time is the ability to look at the age differences. So what do younger men say about it? So we can compare the 18 to 34-year-olds to the 34 to 50-year-olds to the 50 to 65-year-olds, and that's what we do to look at generational change of women and men. In a few countries, there are some things that we might expect, which a younger generation more exposed to, women in the workplace, girls being side by side with them in school, political projects to promote women's rights. In a few countries, we see that also has an impact on men. A younger generation believing in more equitable views, that women are their equals, more accepting of the kind of policies that we think need to be there to achieve structural change in gender equality. But on the whole, it seems to be stagnant or moving backwards. As we weighed together the 30 plus countries that we now have all the data together, unified, optimized in a data set, the vast majority, the direction is, it's either stalled or moving backwards. The younger generation has less equitable views about gender than their fathers, and in some cases than their grandfathers' generation has. And we can look at some, country-specific and regional-specific differences. There have been countries where there have been, a deliberate move backwards. When I say deliberate, political movements that have risen to power. Some of them are political, some of them are cultural, some of them are religious, that have, come to power on saying feminism went too far, we need to push back on it. And so that part is really daunting, because that compares then to almost every country where younger women, if we do the same generational comparison, we have data on women and men, the same countries, women in all the settings, younger women, have more equitable views and expectations of the world than their mothers and their grandmothers' generation. So we have this world, again, this is a big average, nobody's an average, no country's an average, but overall that arc The big piece of the story tells us young women are demanding change. They're demanding equality more than any generation has, and a group of young men who are either stagnant or perhaps moving backwards. Again, probably no young man would see himself as like described in that piece, in that headline. But as we think about the macro and political forces, at bear, there's a lot to look at. And then it also tells us pretty obviously what are the pathways to, more equitable worlds. The countries, and I'm not going to name countries by name, but countries where there's greater economic stability, where there's a stronger social welfare state, where there's been gender equality policies, where women's leadership in multiple spaces has grown. Those are places where men tend to have more progressive views, just as women do. Even with that backlash and stagnation, let's say, with some younger men, they on the whole have more equitable views about gender equality. So social welfare, gender equality policies matter. For individual men, the trajectories are often about, did you have an involved or equitable male somewhere in the household? Not only, sometimes it mattered just as much, was your mother in the workplace and have higher education. So both the things that we've been doing to try to empower women in terms of education and the workplace pay forward in men having more equitable views and more likely to be involved as caregivers, et cetera. And it matters whether men are involved. Not from some simplistic role model perspective, but just that if you internalize an idea that men should be equitable in their decision making, should share household power, should be obligated to share household power equally, are involved in care work. It's a pretty low threshold of care work that's still expected of men around the world. But a little bit of that goes a long way for men to have more equitable views as men, at what it means to be men. And then, the overwhelming message around violence was just how much exposure to violence drives, or is a key factor in driving adult men's use of violence against a female partner in the context of a heterosexual relationship, and how much we just load boys' lives with violence, both what they witness in the home, and mostly male violence, not only, but mostly male violence, and what they experience in schools and in their communities. 60 to 80% of boys experience some physical violence from another male during childhood. Essentially, you don't get through boyhood without some violence from another man. So yeah, those are in 2 minutes the big headlines.
Yeah, a brief summary of a massive piece of data and research. Yeah, and I think also in terms of exposure to violence, things like the media, right? I think you've done some interesting research with like the Gina Davis Institute about how violence is so prevalent among kind of images of masculinity in the media. But one thing as well, which we were interested in terms of what you're doing to try and have a positive influence on kind of like boyhood and kind of the transition to being a man, was the recent launch of the Global Boyhood Initiative with the Kering Foundation and other partners. And you've also, I believe, teamed up with Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex, in the launch of her new podcast, Archetypes. Could you just tell us more about this? It sounds really exciting. And yes, what is the Global Boyhood Initiative? Where is that headed in your view? And when will we hear you talking to Meghan Markle on a rival podcast, of course? But we think she's probably got a few more listeners than us.
We definitely have to circle back on that one. Yeah. So the boyhood work came. It was a kind of a logical next step for us. We had been, we've spent a lot of years working with our Program H and Manhood 2.0, Sisterhood 2.0 group education models of promoting a critical awareness around gender and around masculinities and femininities. That's been used in some 30 plus countries in many contexts together with governments. It's typically kind of ages 14, 15 and above. And, as we looked at these developmental trajectories within the images data and lots of other research, not only ours, of course, of just how much early internalization about ideas of gender made a difference. And not just at the household level. I mean, it's appropriate in telling that we started the Global Boyhood Initiative during COVID, when we are all more wired than we've ever been. I'm father of a daughter who I most days thought that the phone was probably I think it came out of the womb already in her hand, right? That it just felt so much like, and we all are. I'm picking on her, but she's amazing. But we all are, right? It's like our hands have just, evolved to shape around this phone in front of us, the gadgets that we connect online and how much of our lives are made there. And we happened to look at some data that was showing just, who were the highest watchers, streamers, players of any kind of online thing happening are boys ages 8 to 13 in the US. And particularly during COVID, everybody started doing more, but for boys, the amount of time there is even increased. And so said, how do we take this to a younger age? And what would that look like? And we decided to call it the Global Boyhood Initiative, one, because we were already beginning this research in a few countries. And we didn't come up with any other, it was kind of the best descriptor of what we were trying to do with it, that it is about boyhood, not about boys. And what do I mean by that? It's not that we're excluding boys by any means. It is about boys, but it is about changing how we make the world for boyhood, but really to say healthy manhood, connected, nonviolent versions, non-dominating versions, non-patriarchal versions of manhood. The roots of them don't just happen when we step into all the harm of adolescence. They start from the first notions that we have of how we internalize, make sense of what the world affords us in terms of the space provided to be boys and to be girls. And so that's where the idea came from. And it is also inspired by, and let me give credit to Salma Hayek, American actor. She herself was vocal about the abuse she faced from Harvey Weinstein. She has led the foundation itself, the Caring Foundation, in focusing on gender-based violence, and she said, we absolutely need men here. It's not just me and others calling out Harvey Weinstein. What are you doing on this, and why aren't you starting earlier? And we took that provocation as a, kind of a support that, we were beginning to think about that, and they wanted to be full-on partners with it, which was exciting for us. So they Plan International as part of it. Gillette, which you may remember all the stuff they've been talking about boyhood and their ad. They've been doing some work both visibly and behind the scenes in the past years, continuing to support some meaningful work around healthy boyhood and healthy manhood. And Gillette's parent company, P&G, has been a supporter of the Archwell Foundation, and they connected us with Meghan Markle and their staff there, who are also quite committed that men have a meaningful role around being part of the gender equality journey in the world. Those are, we're excited about those partnerships, and I think it pushes us to think kind of outside of our usual activist research spaces. We spend a lot of time, talking to others like us, and I think it's been really good for us as a staff to say, these are corporations in the space. There's some things they do that we agree with, some things they don't, but we do perceive that we can find ways to be partners on overcoming patriarchy. We don't think at any moment we've had to silence anything that we believe about a more economically just, as well as a more gender just world. So they've been interesting journeys.
Yeah, and I mean, quite a few of the things you've said so far, including your work with boys and young men, I suppose, touches upon what has been termed by some as kind of caring masculinities, used, for example, by Niall Hanlon in 2012 in his study on the caring activities of Irish men. So I suppose we were just wondering, what do you understand by that phrase? And, do you find that to be a useful concept? I mean, is that what you're kind of working towards ultimately with things like the Men Care campaign, for example?
And, we're both inspired by that work and others. Some of it that started in the fatherhood space, right? There's been a lot of social service programming and research in the, developmental space and many other spaces around fathers. We launched the Men Care campaign in 2011. Partly, in some ways, I would say it's like a studied act of desperation, which is, it's been, it's been such a contentious conversation in many countries to talk about healthy masculinities, even to question masculinities. It is a political and politicized space, often polarized. And the other challenge, of course, has been to get individual men to actually want to have the conversation, and to be in the room to talk about power and privilege and violence and our own lives, in our own lives, and how, and in the lives of others that we impact with our use of harm and violence. And fatherhood and men's caregiving felt like it was a better, whatever the right word is, the better aspiration than simply to say, we would like you to live a life free of violence. And even equality, as much as it is, our goal at the end of it, doesn't for men feel like something that resonated in their daily lives. That's a problem. But caring felt like it did give us something that men, the vast majority of men in the world aspire to be. And that it, in some ways, if I think about how we as humans, interact and who we are and what we need to thrive and survive, it's what makes us thrive and survive. It's, if there's anything that you would push me and say, could you say this is essentially human in an essentialist way, I'd say, well, it's our ability to care for each other in really complex, long ways, because we're these really fragile creatures when we're born, and we need longer amounts of care, and our big brains mean that we need, to be supported with lots of stuff to internalize our cultures and the ways we interact. Caring is, what ultimately makes us good humans. So it just felt like, I think the gendered nature of how we divide care, and Raywin said this a long time ago around the, how we make the gender binary when we say, women care for homes, bodies, and children, and men go off and do all the rest of the stuff. I mean, we can almost, if there's some plaque that could be established to the beginning of patriarchy and the gender binary, it is on that division where it sits. And so this felt to us like, it's strategic, it's political, it is a root of so much of the unchanging gender inequality, and lo and behold, most men see it as a good thing. So we've been, I think it's been an 11-year journey of saying that in different ways, doing our State of the World's Fathers report, trying to learn from the, and I also want to say we didn't invent the, there's been lots of folks working on the caregiving, the men and care, caring masculinities, caring men, the caregiving space, thoughtful work on fatherhood that, partly we set up Men Care to say we want to learn from this stuff and share what, and amplify what many groups already do, and really try to create a learning network, an exchange network around it. And then, created the State of the World's Fathers report as a way to call some global attention to it. But even more interesting to me is the country reports. South Africa, Brazil, Russia, Republic of Georgia, Portugal, the number of countries that have done country reports and used those for conversations with policymakers and media content makers around how do we promote caring masculinities. And that one, it's resonated, and I'm really excited with the way it continues to grow and the number of new partners who gravitate to it and take it over in good ways.
And that discussion of care there, I mean, that links to, a whole feminist analysis of care and what care is about, doesn't it? I mean, Jean Tronto's work about, is it caring about, or is it caring for, or is it care giving or care receiving?
Yeah.
There's a huge literature around that. And you also made me think of the COVID time as well, in a way.
Yeah.
That care became so central then. I mean, I don't know whether we're slipping back to the old normal, but actually that was a huge part of what we've all been through globally.
Yeah. And both politically, I think we have tried to be attuned, dialogue with, Sandy, you've been part of those conversations, Nikki Vandegog, fantastic on many of those conversations as well, of, making sure that as it's often easy for men in the space of kind of seeing the power and the personal transformation coming about by doing more care work, that we kind of feel like we invented it, right? That's the masculine hubris will often step in and go, yes, we invented this now. Now we own care. And to try to center it and say, let's look at the care we all need. Let's look at the feminist analysis. Let's look at the fact that women around the world still do more than 3 times of it. It is still, among the most underpaid professions. We don't, and so to keep that political edge to it while we want men to feel their personal connection to it. So really trying, I think our best partnerships, the most meaningful and necessary partnerships with that work have been with the women's rights advocates who have been calling for it, and who in a sense during COVID, we were all going, wow, look how important care was. I think they were saying, hey, we already knew it always was. You just don't pay attention to how much your lives and bodies, and in fact your income as men, is dependent on this care every single day. So we're glad you see this, boys, now that we're looking at COVID, but we have been paying attention to this for many, many years.
And you've mentioned kind of a few times about politics, and I suppose perhaps we wanted to ask you about that a bit more directly, because it's impossible to, given that you're living in the US, it's impossible not to discuss it, really, isn't it, with so much that's been going on over there. And obviously, very soon it's the midterm elections as well, isn't it, in the US? And of course, we've seen such political turmoil. Also here in the UK, it should be said. But we'll focus on the US for now.
Yeah, we have our own problems.
Yes, for sure. But yeah, I mean, things like, threats to democracy, the Capitol Hill attack, the rolling back of abortion rights, ever-increasing toll from gun violence, which connects to your own personal experience as well. And a lot of these issues clearly have a lot to do with masculinity. So I suppose we're just wondering, really, like, how do you feel about this situation in the US currently? I mean, are you really concerned about the direction that politics is going in over there right now? Or do you see kind of opportunities for hope and for change as well still?
Oh, Stephen, it's a Friday, and you had to bring up this topic. Oh my God!
I'm sorry.
Oh my God! Where do we begin? Well, and I'll add to that. I'm in a Brazilian-U.S. household. Where my partner's Brazilian, our daughter's from both countries. 2 members of our household. Well, 1 member votes in both countries. 2 of us just vote in one of our countries of our passports. But all to say, yeah, we've been living, very clearly what's happening in Brazil as well as what's happening in the U.S. Yes. I live 5 kilometers from the epicenter of January 6th, and was at the March for Black Lives Matter when Trump had troops ringed around the White House and tear gas and the helicopters, and led by my my adult daughter, my 23-year-old, what was she then, 22-year-old daughter at the time, of saying, "Dad, we're going here. This is where we are going here," and instructing me on how to be prepared for tear gas and the rest. Of saying, wow, we still have to do this kind of marching. I was at the Women's March right after Trump's inauguration and feeling the power of women's voices there. At the same time, just the desperation we feel, and the midterm elections are quite frightening, and it has been white men with less than university education who are Trump's voters, women too, frightening the number of Hispanic and African American voters that Trump also gets. So, regardless of the outcome in November, manhood has been weaponized in the middle of this. We've got Josh Hawley as a senator writing a book because he's afraid that those of us on the progressive side are destroying American manhood. I might sometimes say he's right, so he's got a right to be frightened, but he doesn't realize the flip side of this, which is that this is good for all of us. And we've been trying to engage, there's some really, really thoughtful activists and writers on this topic, thinking about, how do we pull back from this this kind of fractured state that we're in and pull masculinities out as a weapon, because it really, really traditional, harmful, restrictive, violent views of masculinities are so much being used. They're part of the arsenal that the far right is using. We're beginning some new research on it. We're engaging with some feminist activist groups. We're looking with some of the groups that look at hate expression online and trying to say, what can we do? We are very alarmed. We want to be able to call it the harm, but also trying to, I don't think it's enough to be alarmed. We've got to figure out what is it that's leading men to be Trump voters, to be Bolsonaro voters. What is the economic uncertainty? What is the way that we consume media, the way that we get ourselves in our own bubbles and end up only knowing people who think and act and talk like us? What have we achieved with the feminist agenda that we've not done in a structural way that men perceive themselves as invested in it? Do they see it as an agenda against them or with them? Do we revert to zero-sum policies on the left and on the right? And I think we also have to hold ourselves to account as on the progressive side of what are we doing about how we present our message? And I'm intrigued by, inspired by the Me Too moment and the Me Too movement. Had a chance to hear Tarana Burke speak in a couple of occasions, and all of that work is inspiring, and it energizes what we do, and and what we want to support in terms of the women who have led this work. And she said, I never expected we'd have an impact in a few years. This is a decades-long battle that we're going to be in. And I think when I get helpless and hopeless on a Friday afternoon of what can we do about this, is to keep that in mind. The women who led this work, the women of color, the marginalized voices who, at least in my country, if I look at Black Lives Matter and I look at Me Too of the last years, and those movements both represent decades of activism and of so many voices, of just to say, it's not just this November election. I may be celebrating or I may be lamenting, but this battle is going to go on. And I don't know on this Friday morning, afternoon, if I would say I'm optimistic or not, but I'll remember my daughter who, when Trump won and we said, let's move back to Brazil, and she said, Dad, we don't run, we stay and fight. So the the wisest words I heard in the last years.
At risk of ruining your whole weekend, you mentioned what's been happening in Brazil, and of course I think you lived there for pretty much 20 years or 15 years. So it'd be interesting just to get your view on that. Obviously the rise of Bolsonaro, his masculinized posturing, his family corruption, right-wing populism, evangelical support, destruction of the Amazon. You can go on with this stuff, and it feels like some of his story is actually precursor to the Trump story as well, and deeply frightening for both the people there and the whole world. We're all depending on the Amazon's future, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, just as what the U.S. pollutes by not taking climate change seriously, we seem to be doing something, moving in the right direction on that. Brazil, not so much. These playbooks, this is part of globalization, is the playbooks go back and forth, and folks like Stephen Bannon travel to both places and share their ideas, and they, the kinds of stuff that we do on the progressive side of exchanging ideas, they're doing with a lot more money than we do. Orban exchanges ideas with Modi, who's, press people get ideas from Bolsonaro, and so, that globalized world has led us to lots of feminist activism that we can also do, but it also is, the far right is probably better at it than we are, or can be at times. It's frightening how it becomes so obvious, right? That the scripts just are so interchangeable. It's just like, that's the same, that's the same made-for-TV drama. You've just changed the names of the characters, but the stories are so similar. And kind of playing up into the edge, and then they call back, well, I didn't mean it that way. I didn't really mean to exterminate all of them, but the kind of the rhetorical flourishes, the playing on fear, the seeing that they get more votes the more they play on fear, the appealing to the frightened lower and middle class that doesn't really see where economically where we headed. So they both enact the policies that cause the economic shocks, and then they benefit with votes by saying, look, we're the only ones who can protect you from this chaotic world. Let us go somewhere else.
You're ruining my weekend also now.
You started it.
Okay, let's turn to something else. We're coming close to the end now anyway. I mentioned at the start that you've actually written, I think, 4 novels, which have all been set in very different locations. You wrote The Afghan Vampires Club with your friend and fellow activist, Michael Kaufman. You've written Mary of Kivu, about the conflict in DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo. But also you've written The Museum of Lost Love, which I think which brings together a number of strands, including the war in former Yugoslavia. I wondered how you saw the relationship between, what you're writing about as fiction and, the professional work that you do. Yeah. What is that relationship about? And
fiction came about, smarter people go to therapy. I decided to write, stories that in some ways were, doing work the work with men and masculinities requires listening to some of the really horrible stories of harm, of hurt, of violence used. And I've had, the good fortune and to work in some amazing settings with activists and researchers on these topics. DRC you mentioned, Afghanistan, Brazil, many parts of Latin America. My first novel was about the civil war in Guatemala, where I had a chance to live and work with some amazing activists as well. And while my day job has been writing reports and training materials and engaging with activists, on what can we do to achieve the social change that we desire. And it's, it is exhausting, it is emotionally wearing, and fiction was a place to kind of tell fictional accounts of amazing people that I've met, and also a place to channel, just thinking about men and our mistakes and our flaws, and our deep emotions that we don't tend to express all that much. And so, fiction writing, particularly during jet lag moments, stuck in hotels and airports, and electricity out in a guest room in Goma, where I have to flee 2 days later. It's just this moment of either I'm going to drink too much and cause my body some harm, or I'm going to try to channel these voices into some compelling stories. And I've had the luck of a publisher based in the Netherlands that's liked my stuff and has worked with me to turn it into, I hope, respectable fiction that's gotten some fun attention. But for me, it's therapeutic, and it's kind of also fun, and you don't have to use footnotes, and I don't have to do any PowerPoints from it, and I just get to kind of, it's been fun, and it's a fun way to also engage in conversations about these topics without having to step into all of the politics of it, which I do and love and will continue doing. But it's like putting in a different, going from being a mathematician to a musician or something.
And on that note, we thought it might be nice to ask you if you wanted to just read out a short passage from one of your novels. I don't know if you want to introduce that yourself, or do you just want to read what you've
I just happen to have one of them in hand here.
Oh, that's great.
Museum, Museum of Lost Love is inspired by a real-life museum in Zagreb called the Museum of Broken Relationships. It's been around for about...
I've been there.
It's amazing, right?
I've been there geographically. I'm not sure. I've probably been there metaphorically as well.
Say, but hey. I don't really trust somebody who's not had a breakup. If you've never either had your heart broken or been the harm causer of breaking someone's heart, I kind of feel like it's an important human milestone. And that's where the book came out of. That museum it's objects of love gone wrong and letters. I had the chance to visit it after I had done some work with, young men affected by the conflict, a few of them ex-combatants or their fathers or others in their family ex-combatants. I was from the Serb enclave of Bosnia to Sarajevo and back, traveling with an ex-combatant, trying to make sense of what was going on there and the masculinities in the backdrop. And at the end of that trip, they took me to this museum, and I went the next day on my own, and I was just intrigued by, and of course I did a social scientist reading of what it was. It was mostly men doing women wrong, and it was mostly all the stuff that men are so clumsy about and harm creating, in relationships. And, just as some of us who should get therapy, we start to have voices in our head telling us, oh my God, there's a character here from Brazil, and there's one here who's a veteran from the Afghan war in Texas, and he's going to be in the story. And there's a couple of folks in the backdrop of the former Yugoslavia that are going to be in my head too. And then somebody I met, a Bosnian, refugee to Chicago who I met years before, a version of him is going to be here. And lo and behold, a year and a half later, there's about 300 pages, and I have a published book, which I got to launch at the museum, which was really fun. That was really fun. So there's a moment when the two couples who are protagonists are visiting the museum. One of them is Goran. He's that Bosnian refugee that I mentioned. His family, he's a Bosnian Serb. His family moved to the U.S. at the beginning of the war. He finds an object in the museum that he didn't know was there from a girl that he had met in the transit camp when his family was getting out. And he's quite moved by this, and he has gone there with his American girlfriend, whose name is Katya. And Katya is looking at the museum while she sees Goran crying, looking at this exhibit from the girl that he met 20 some years before. And so there's a moment when this is the narrator in Katya's head. And Katya, at the beginning of the book that Katya and Goran had they were together. They thought they were going to be together as a couple, but they're not when the book starts. And so Katya is looking back, remembering the moment that Goran found that object in the museum. And she says this: with each day away from Goran, she was learning this. The normal state of lovers, of couples, is not together. Together is a transient state. The normal state of things is as much about ending and leaving as it is about beginning and staying. The normal state of love is living with the possibility that everything can, at a moment's notice, come tumbling down. We impossibly walk for some amount of time in the same pages, in the same narrative, and we deny with every breath the possibility, indeed the likelihood, that the arc of the story bends toward being alone. Every city, Katya thought, every village, every neighborhood should have a museum like the one Goran had taken her to visit more than a year ago. Children should be given classes in how to break up and move on, how to mourn the sudden loss of all-encompassing love or the end of an intense, fleeting affair and carry on with dignity, how to let someone get that close, know you that way, and let them go, taking with them your secret words and bedroom stories and those private little cries and tremors, how to walk into the story with kindness and walk out of it without drawing blood. By children, I mean boys, particularly, and men. How do we deal with loss? I got some interesting letters and emails from some men talking about how difficult it was for them to talk about love and loss when the book made some press in the UK and the US. Anyway.
No, that was great. Thanks so much, Gary. We're going to have to love you and leave you, I'm afraid, but in a different way, in the nicest possible way.
I'll write about you, Sandy. I will put it in the next story.
I'll look forward to myself in the next novel. But it's been great spending time with you. Thank you so much. I mean, it's a real sort of ride that we've been on through all the work that you've been doing over the years. So thank you for that.
And it's been a pleasure working with you two on several things, including your very thoughtful work on COVID and masculinities, and
thank you.
You two have been inspirations to me and our team as well. So we appreciate that.
Well, thank you. No, and I'm going to go away and read some of your
books.
All right.
They sound amazing.
Yeah. Give them. It's early for Christmas. You can buy lots of them and give them away as Christmas presents. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks so much, Gary.
Thanks for having me.
Bye now.
Wow, what a fascinating, wide-ranging and informative conversation that was with Gary. I mean, it's so impressive, all of the work he's done and Equimundo have done over the years, and I really am kind of impressed by the writing he's doing. Can you tell us a little bit, though, Sandy? I'm really intrigued about the Museum of Broken Relationships. What were you doing there, and what happened?
Well, after all those fascinating things that Gary was telling us about, you chose to pick out the Museum of Broken Relationships. I wonder why. But it was extraordinary, really. I mean, the museum's in Zagreb, as I think Gary said. We happened to be in Zagreb for a Men Engage meeting at one point, and so all the sort of participants at the meeting trundled along to the Museum of Broken Relationships and came out again, well, broken themselves in various ways. I think. I mean, to be serious about it. I mean, there's some amazing stuff there. All the sort of mementos that people have left. The letters, the artifacts, the shoes, all kinds of stuff really, and then a little description of what happened, and all the sort of all the emotions you can imagine just sort of tumbling out of people really in their writing about why they submitted a particular item to the museum, So it's an extraordinary idea, really. I even seen A, it's been on tour, and B, they're asking for contributions. So if there's any of you listening out there who think, I'm up for that, then do submit whatever you have. But don't blame us if it appears on the shelves. But
I suppose there is a serious point there as well, isn't there, which Gary kind of alluded to about how, perhaps we don't talk enough about relationships and how men kind of deal with those and the difficulties, a lot of men might have, especially if a relationship comes to an end, for example, and how to deal with the kind of emotional fallout of that, which is very difficult for anybody, especially, if you're not necessarily encouraged to talk to other people about what's going on in your life.
Yes, I agree, Stephen. And of course, Gary's work provides some inspiration for us in thinking about how to tackle, address, confront some of these serious issues that we're all faced with. But I think that's it for today, isn't it, Stephen?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, everybody, for listening. As always, we'll be back again soon with another episode. And in the meantime, if you haven't already, do subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Leave a review. Get in touch with us if you've got questions or comments at nowamen@gmail.com. But for now, take care and speak to you again soon.
Bye now.